Berlin, the 1st of May 1939. Model National Socialist companies are awarded gold flags and publicly feted for their services to the nation and regime. Among them is aircraft manufacturer Siebel Flugzeugwerke in Halle an der Saale. Around 6 years after seizing power, the National Socialists seem to have established almost total control over German society.
Der Nationalsozialismus als totale Ideologie
As a totalitarian ideology, National Socialism seeks to penetrate and control every area of life. Nazi institutions are created with the aim of governing people's lives from cradle to grave. The National Socialists knew they didn't have the support of the entire nation, and they needed that support to achieve their goals.
At the new Reich Chancellery on Wilhelmstrasse in the center of Berlin, Adolf Hitler makes only rare appearances these days. He spends much of the summer at his mountain court, his retreat at Obersalzberg. In the company of close allies, the dictator crafts his plans to dominate the continent.
The National Socialists see themselves as fighting for the revision of the Treaty of Versailles and the restoration of German national greatness. But there are racial and territorial conditions. They believe Germany is entitled to colonize lands in the East, and they believe in the superiority of the Aryan race. Hitler set that out in Mein Kampf, claiming that the racially superior German nation ultimately had a right to dominate inferior, less cultured groups, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union.
But it is still too early for a confrontation with the Soviet Union. The first stage of Third Reich expansion is planned elsewhere. After the annexation of Austria and the breakup of Czechoslovakia, the dictator switches his focus to Poland.
Hitler actually saw Poland as a junior partner for his war against the Soviet Union. That's why he signed a non-aggression pact with Poland in the early 1930s. But it soon became clear that Poland planned to pursue its own policies and had no intention of being Hitler's acquiescent friend and helper. So Hitler tears up the non-aggression pact and demands that Danzig be incorporated into the German Reich.
Danzig looks back on a turbulent history between Poland and Germany. Unlike East Prussia, it was separated from the German Reich under the Treaty of Versailles and placed under the authority of the League of Nations. Most of Danzig's population are German, and many are reluctant to accept the city's new fate. So are the National Socialists, who skillfully exploit the situation for their own ends.
That played right into their hands, of course, because they could always say 99% of the population are German. Why can't they be part of the Reich? The Nazis had been presented with an open goal, and their propaganda machine sent the ball zinging into the net.
Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels makes several trips to the historic Hanseatic city and delivers inflammatory speeches to cheering crowds.
Auch diese Stadt mit ihren Menschen gehört zu diesem Volkstum. Sie ist deutsch und bleibt deutsch.
But Hitler would never have been content with just Danzig, and he says that quite clearly on several occasions. He tells the chiefs of the armed forces so in briefings ahead of the Polish campaign. It is no longer just about Danzig. It is about a great deal more than that. Danzig is just a symbol of the sense of entitlement to Polish territory.
Goebbels knows full well at this time that war on Poland has long been a certainty. His appearances in Danzig are just part of the game. Back in May 1939, Hitler told army chiefs that the decision had been taken to attack Poland at the earliest opportunity. The dictator's words were recorded by his adjutant-in-chief Rudolf Schmundt. The Führer issues the order to prepare for an early invasion. But in public, the regime insists it wants peace and denounces Poland as the aggressor. In newspapers and newsreels, reports of assaults on the German minority in Poland are systematically exaggerated.
Während die Bevölkerung Danzigs ruhig und vertrauensvoll die Heimkehr ins Reich erwartet, sind die Volksdeutschen innerhalb der polnischen Grenzen wildestem Terror ausgesetzt. Viele Tausende flüchteten vor den Gewalttätigkeiten der Polen in den Schutz des Reiches und fanden vorläufig in Sammellagern Aufnahme.
Man muss sozusagen Leidensdruck
You have to present a convincing level of distress so that the long-planned military intervention that is being prepared, and has been since at least May 1939, can be credibly presented as an act of national defense. And that calls for agitation, propaganda, reports of alleged Polish atrocities against German civilians.
Einfach ausschlachtbares Propagandamaterial.
The tension between the two countries escalates. Poland launches a program to modernize its army, which stages a public demonstration of strength under the eyes of Commander-in-Chief Marshal Ritz Schmieg. The parade is presented in Nazi propaganda as a sign of expansionist intent.
Ritz Schmieg lässt seine Heerscharen paradieren. Man träumt von einem größeren Polen. Der politische Größenwahn der Epigonen Pilsudskis ist ohne Maß.
The German Reich holds maneuvers on its eastern border. Among those taking part is the 6th Tank Regiment, a part of the newly formed 3rd Tank Division. On the 20th of August 1939, the units head east. One of the officers has a camera and films the operation.
In summer 1939, it is already clear that war is imminent, that Hitler wants war, and that the maneuvers on the eastern border are being held for precisely that reason. They give troops a chance to acclimatize and hone their skills.
The 6th Tank Regiment arrives in Ratzebur near Szczecin, a strategically favorable location for a strike. But the time is not yet ripe. Hitler has a problem. He doesn't know how his arch-enemy, the Soviet Union, will react to a German attack on Poland. He fears that Stalin might side with the Western powers against him. On the 23rd of August, Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop flies to Moscow in Hitler's personal plane. In the Russian capital, he surprises the world by signing a non-aggression pact with his opposition number, Vyacheslav Molotov. Joseph Stalin is delighted with the agreement.
The really interesting thing about the Hitler-Stalin Pact is the secret protocol included in it. It defines spheres of influence in the event of action being taken against Poland. Basically speaking, Germany gets the western territories and the Soviet Union the eastern ones, notably eastern Galicia.
Hitler is well aware of the treaty's huge strategic importance. On the evening of the 23rd of August, he and his inner circle wait impatiently at Berghof for news from Moscow. The message that the treaty has been signed does not arrive till after midnight. The pact paves the way for Hitler to go to war. Nationwide, there are growing signs that armed conflict is imminent. One clear indication is the issue of ration cards. The sale of certain commodities, such as fat, was already controlled. Now, there is general food rationing.
The moment war breaks out, the first priority is to supply soldiers at the front. So the laws of the market are basically suspended by issuing ration cards. Even if people have money, they cannot get food for cash. They have to show entitlement. And that system of entitlement is the real crux of rationing. It gives the state systematic control over consumption.
People prepare for the anticipated food shortages. The older generation still remember the hunger endured during the First World War. Provisions are stockpiled, just in case. The newsreels present footage of men reporting for military service. But unlike in 1914, there is little enthusiasm for the impending conflict in the late summer of '39.
The German intelligence services note that the public mood is somber. People know what happens when a great war is waged on the Western powers. They know it brings death, suffering, and deprivation. And for the majority of Germans in 1939, that is a ghastly prospect.
Regardless of the public mood, the German Reich flexes its muscles. There's a demonstrative naval presence in the Baltic. After the loss of much of the high seas fleet in the First World War, the country has redoubled its rearmament effort since the mid-1930s. The fleet includes SMS Schleswig-Holstein, which calls at Danzig on the 25th of September. A propaganda film shows the reception.
Jubelnd empfängt die alte Hansestadt das Schulschiff Schleswig-Holstein, das ihr den Gruß der Kriegsmarine entbietet.
On the afternoon of the 25th of August, Hitler gives the order for the assault on Poland to commence the next day. But only hours later, the order is revoked when it is learned that Britain has signed a mutual assistance pact with Poland, and the Italian dictator Mussolini says his country is not yet ready to go to war. In the days that follow, diplomats try to save the peace, among them the UK ambassador in Berlin, Naval Henderson. Hitler makes a half-hearted show of engaging with attempts at mediation, but his mind is made up. The specter of war casts a shadow over Europe. At the end of August 1939, Poland's ally France mobilizes for war, building a fighting force of around 90 divisions. And despite diplomatic endeavors, preparations for a conflict with Germany are also made in London. The Anglo-Polish Mutual Assistance Pact will kick in if either of the two nations is attacked. So Hitler looks for a way to present Poland as the aggressor. He says, "I will provide a propagandistic casus belli. Its credibility doesn't matter. The victor will not be asked whether he told the truth."
Hitler orders a series of false flag operations, faking Polish attacks on Germany. One of the best known is the Gleiwitz incident, where a German radio station is attacked by SS operatives in Polish army uniforms.
Shortly after 8 p.m. on the 31st of August, the SS group breaks into the radio station on Tarnowitzer Straße in Gleiwitz. Posing as anti-German saboteurs, the men broadcast a communiqué in Polish. To make the assault more credible, they leave behind the body of Silesian farmer Franz Honiok, who had been abducted and murdered the previous day. The operation lasts only minutes, but it gives Hitler the excuse he seeks to issue the order to attack.
The whole charade was staged to persuade the international public, and especially the Germans, that this was war in self-defense, that Germany was the victim, not the aggressor.
More than 55 German divisions stand ready to invade Poland. Among them is the 6th Tank Regiment, which moves into strike position on the 31st of August and awaits further orders. Recent arrival Schleswig-Holstein is still at anchor in Danzig port. She's been assigned a special role in the attack on Poland. At around 4:45 in the morning, German radio broadcasts this message.
Das Linienschiff Schleswig-Holstein wird in wenigen Sekunden den Feuerkampf auf die Westerplatte eröffnen.
The Westerplatte Peninsula is the site of Polish munitions dumps, which now come under fire from the sea. World War II has started, and a radio reporter gives people in Germany a blow-by-blow account.
Wir sind etwa 200 Meter von der Schleswig-Holstein weg und ungefähr 1 Kilometer von der Westerplatte.
Positioned a couple of hundred meters from the Schleswig-Holstein and around a kilometer from Westerplatte, he describes with growing excitement the hail of shells falling on Polish soil.
Der Feuerkampf ist eröffnet. Die deutschen Waffen sprechen jetzt vor Danzig.
Minutes earlier, the German Luftwaffe had appeared without warning and bombed the Polish town of Wilun, east of Breslau. Wave after wave of planes reduced the town center to dust and ashes. The demonstration of German air power claims more than 1,000 lives. And shortly afterwards, German dive bombers joined the battle for Danzig. Another direct hit. While the naval shelling and aerial bombardment continue, the German army advances. A force of more than 1.5 million men and over 3,000 tanks enters Poland in a multi-pronged invasion.
In September 1939, Poland was very exposed, geographically isolated. It was hemmed on 3 sides by East Prussia, Silesia and Slovakia, where German troops were also stationed. Another problem was that Poland's leaders were determined not to give an inch of ground, so they could perhaps have chosen better defensive positions. As it was, the German troops overran the Polish front line very quickly.
Within hours, Hitler speaks to the German nation and announces the outbreak of what he calls the defensive war.
Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit bereits regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 Uhr wird jetzt zurückgeschossen.
In Danzig, the fighting spreads to the city center. In the early hours of the 1st of September, Polish personnel hole up in the Polish post office building. They have access to a cache of weapons stored away in anticipation of a German attack. Several attempts to take the building are successfully repelled, but late in the afternoon, German engineers blast a hole in the facade. Petrol is then pumped into the basement and the building set on fire. The situation becomes increasingly hopeless for the defenders, and they surrender. Some are shot on the spot, most of the others are later executed. War shows its brutal face from the very beginning.
The Wehrmacht soldiers did not need to be persuaded to go to war against Poland. What with the consequences of the First World War, the status of Danzig and so on, German perceptions of Poland were very negative. There was no appetite for a major war against Britain or France, but there was no objection to taking up arms against Poland.
Aber dass es gegen Polen, dass man da auch zur Waffe greifen würde, das war akzeptiert.
In the evening of the 1st of September, less than 24 hours after the outbreak of hostilities, Danzig is declared German again. The Wehrmacht enter the city amid cheering crowds, while the fighting on Westerplatte continues. In Berlin, Hitler appears before a tame Reichstag and defends the military action. Britain and France issue an ultimatum for Germany to withdraw its troops from Poland, but the Führer brushes off their demands. On the 3rd of September, the two powers declare war on the German Reich.
Hitler war entsetzt, weil nicht wirklich.
Hitler was horrified because he hadn't really expected Britain to stick to the Common Defense Pact with Poland. He always dreamt, right up to 1945, of standing alongside this global power, the British Empire.
Weltmacht, die akzeptierte, dem britischen Empire quasi Hand in Hand.
He would create a pan-Germanic empire on the continent, and the two of them would rule the world together.
Auf dem Kontinent zu errichten und beide zusammen dann die Welt zu beherrschen.
British expeditionary forces embark for France from Guernsey in the English Channel. As in the First World War, troops are deployed to help Allied French forces meet an anticipated German attack. The German Reich risks fighting a war on two fronts. Poland in the east has now been joined by an enemy on Germany's western border, France. The response is immediate. Border villages are evacuated to give the Wehrmacht room to operate. German army units take up positions along the frontier, but they initially find they have little to do.
Britain and France do not attack. Why not? They are easily the more powerful force. Most of Germany's troops are in the east, in Poland. But French military doctrine says that success is best sought in defense, not attack. First, let enemies advance, then attack when they are weakened. And that's the lesson the French learned from the First World War. And they think it will work again now.
The waiting game that follows is known in Germany as the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. The French know it as the drôle de guerre, the funny or strange war. Apart from a few propaganda exercises, the German armed forces remain passive, and despite having declared war on the German Reich, Britain and France also take little military action.
They are simply not willing to engage in ground warfare for a little country like Poland. There's a move towards borders, to the peripheries, but there is no desire as yet to intervene in Central Europe.
The German Wehrmacht can thus focus on the campaign in the east. Both Army Group North under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock and Army Group South under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt rapidly make major territorial gains. Tactics play an important role.
Of all the armed forces in the Second World War, the Wehrmacht proves most adept at launching combined arms operations, especially in the early stages of the war. That means coordinating service branches so that they mesh and work together, like teeth in a gearbox.
A key role is played by aerial reconnaissance, which is generally performed by Dornier 17s and Henschel 126s. The crews take photographs, which are then minutely analyzed on the ground. A propaganda film documents their work.
Geschulte Fachoffiziere und Mannschaften ermöglichen durch gute Arbeitsteilung die strategische und taktische Auswertung der von den Aufklärern eingebrachten Beute. Das entwickelte Material gibt der Führung wichtige Unterlagen für Planung und Durchführung weiterer Operationen.
The advancing German armies leave behind a trail of devastation. On the 3rd of September, a soldier in the 14th Army notes in his diary, "The routes of the advancing divisions are easy to identify. On our way to the front, we pass endless streams of civilians and burning homes. The fields near the road are littered with the bizarrely twisted corpses of Polish civilians. We all look, but few grimace. Everyone just thinks it's war." For many of the inexperienced German soldiers, the distinction between civilians and partisans becomes blurred.
In the campaign against Poland, German abuses, German crimes are committed at a very early stage. In the Wehrmacht, it's primarily because soldiers are nervous and inexperienced and fear an ambush at every turn. They are quick to overreact. They set whole villages on fire and they kill hostages.
Man weiß nicht, ob es tatsächlich so eine Art
We don't know whether there really was some kind of guerrilla war in Poland, but the Wehrmacht certainly came to believe they were caught up in one. Then they started shooting at anything that moved.
Angst auf alles schossen, was sich nur irgendwie bewegte.
Apart from these acts of violence, there is early evidence of ideologically motivated crimes against Polish civilians.
It is a war of annihilation from the outset, a war aimed at the absolute decimation of the Polish nation. Einsatzgruppen, SS death squads, are operating behind the Wehrmacht lines, and the result is the murder of at least 60,000 civilians, politicians, clerics, and academics, many of them members of the Jewish faith.
At the outbreak of the Second World War, Jews make up around 10% of the Polish population. Before long, that minority becomes a focus for the Einsatzgruppen and a victim of excessive violence. National Socialist propaganda has demonized Jews for years and seeks to stir up hostility even more. Propaganda films and newsreels become vehicles for incitement campaigns specifically targeting Jews.
Dieses ostjüdische Untermenschentum hat seit jeher Westeuropa das internationale Verbrechergesindel geliefert. Von hier aus wurden die Demokratien mit Taschendieben, Zuhältern, Rauschgift- und Mädchenhändlern, internationalen Bankschiebern und Hetzjournalisten versorgt. Das sind dieselben Juden, deren Brüder, Söhne und Vettern in London und Paris für die Humanität und Zivilisation das große Wort führen.
5 Einsatzgruppen, with a total of around 3,000 men, were initially formed for the Polish campaign. While they commit murder behind the front line, the German armed forces press on with their advance. On the 6th of September, the 10th Army significantly breaches the Polish defenses. The Polish High Command orders its troops to retreat behind the San, Bug, and Weichsel rivers. The same day, German units take numerous cities in the south of Poland, including Tarnow. The ground force benefits from a new form of support from the air.
Back in the First World War, the air arm's primary function was reconnaissance. Now planes are used to provide tactical support for troops on the ground, a new idea that is embraced only by the German Wehrmacht in the early war years.
In the invasion of Poland, the Wehrmacht deploys 2 air fleets with over 1,100 aircraft. Particularly feared are the Stukas, the German dive bombers. As they dive, they make a screaming sound that terrifies and undermines morale.
Zurück im Einsatzhafen sind unsere Stukas einige 100 Kilo leichter. Aber das verlorene Gewicht wird wieder ausgeglichen. Ran mit einer neuen Bombe!
Each Stuka can carry a payload of 1,800 kilos, and it's feared by soldiers and civilians alike. On the home front, the military successes in the early days of the war are followed with keen interest. Newspapers put out special issues reporting on developments at the front line. But no one can expect the truth here. The press has been under National Socialist control for years. The same goes for radio, but despite censorship, the dark side of the war quickly becomes apparent. Trainloads of casualties arrive from the front line. Military hospitals and infirmaries spring up all over the country. Here, a converted school at Korbach in Hesse. An amateur filmmaker records the busy hospital at work and the surgery that is performed. By the end of the Polish campaign, around 30,000 German soldiers have been wounded and some 15,000 have lost their lives. Before long, scenes like this are an everyday sight in Germany. 21 years after the end of the First World War, fallen soldiers are again laid to rest.
In the early days of the war, when soldiers killed in action are still returned home for burial, the regime's stage manages the funerals as tributes to heroes.
Ganz klar, des Nationalsozialismus. Auch die ganze Familie.
The entire family of the deceased are showcased to put across the message that if something bad like this happens, it is a life sacrificed for the regime. And the regime will not forget the family.
Und das Regime wird die Angehörigen nicht vergessen.
The Nazi propaganda machine prefers to present other images. Since the war started, Adolf Hitler has paid regular visits to troops in the field, and he makes sure they are filmed. Here, the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces salutes German units crossing the River San.
Hitler likes to be seen with the troops during the Polish campaign. He does so primarily for propaganda reasons, of course, to show Germans that their Führer and Chancellor is now also a soldier. He knows what it's like. He knows from the First World War what it's like to be a simple serviceman on the front line. And for the troops, the message is, he is with you. The intention is to boost morale, of course, and strengthen the bond between members of the armed forces and their Führer and supreme commander.
The Betsura River near Kutno in central Poland. Undetected by German reconnaissance, parts of the Polish Pomorze and Poznan armies join forces here and confront the advancing Germans. For a while, the German 8th Army under General Blaskowitz finds itself hard-pressed by the Polish offensive. But with the help of parts of the 4th and 10th Armies, the Polish forces are ultimately surrounded. On the 19th of September, the battle is won. Around 170,000 Polish soldiers become German prisoners of war and thus face an uncertain future.
Crimes against the civilian population and against prisoners of war are documented from a fairly early stage in the Polish campaign. I think ideology certainly played a part, but there is also what you might call a cultural divide. As in the First World War, Poles are seen as culturally inferior. It's a fairly old perception with the potential to arouse and unleash violence. And above all, the Nazi regime and Wehrmacht institutions do nothing to curb that violence.
Eine Institution, die eben auch gegen diese Gewalt nicht vorgehen.
What is more, the Wehrmacht cannot cope from the outset with the large number of prisoners. On the 8th of September, the 7th Army Corps of Army Group South reports that conditions behind the rapidly advancing ground force are appalling. More than 6,000 prisoners and internees are entirely without food and virtually unguarded. A total of 400,000 Polish soldiers fall into German captivity during the campaign. Many of them are later deported and forced into slave labor. On the 17th of September, the Polish armed forces suffer another heavy blow. The Red Army invades from the east.
When the Red Army crosses the border on the 17th of September, it's effectively game over for Poland. The country cannot possibly win a war on two fronts. There might have been a chance of staying off defeat if there was only one front, but even that would have been difficult. And the events of the 17th of September can mean only one thing. It's every man for himself.
In the protocol to the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Third Reich and the Soviet Union divided up Poland between them and defined the Bug River as the demarcation line. Within days of the Red Army entering Poland, the invaders meet at Brest-Litovsk and mark their success with a celebratory joint military parade. Less than 2 years later, Wehrmacht and Red Army troops will meet again, but as enemies after Germany invades the Soviet Union in June 1941. The outcome of the war in Poland has been decided, but the fighting is not yet over. Military action is now focused on the battle for the capital. Warsaw has been surrounded since the 13th of September, but German troops have so far failed to take the city. American filmmaker Julian Bryan is one of the last foreign journalists present in Warsaw in September. His camera records the people's desperate attempts to protect their city.
The Germans start to wonder if they'll surrender. A short, sharp offensive fails. Before long, German tanks are outside Warsaw, but they are kept at bay by the Poles. The question now is, how can the Poles be made to surrender?
The Luftwaffe provides the answer. On the 25th of September, more than 1,500 missions are flown over Warsaw. Over 500 tons of high explosive and dozens of tons of incendiary bombs are dropped by wave after wave of aircraft. Operation Wasserkante, Waterfront, is based on a plan of attack developed by the Luftwaffe before the war.
Für das Ende des Krieges ist sie sicherlich eminent wichtig.
It is eminently important for the end of the war, because the German army does not relish the prospect of a long house-to-house fight for Warsaw. Wasserkante enables it to break the defenders' spirit, but it also means the civilian population suffers.
large parts of the city are razed to the ground. No distinction is made between civilian and military targets. Julian Bryan films the devastation at a hospital that fell victim to the bombing. The nursery ward was evacuated in time. Other people in the city were not so lucky. More than 25,000 people are killed. A propaganda film presents the Nazi version of events, blaming the Poles for the inferno. They should have surrendered the city earlier. The commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, boasts about the air arm's achievement.
Diese Luftwaffe hat hier Leistungen vollbracht, die für immer unvergänglich sein werden. Als einst in Versailles dem deutschen Volk diese herrliche Waffe genommen wurde, da ahnte man nicht, dass unter der Führung Adolf Hitlers diese Waffe neuer, stärker und mächtiger wieder entstehen würde.
2 months later, the top brass of the Luftwaffe deliver a triumphant report on the bombardment. They speak in particularly glowing terms about the incendiary bomb B-1 Fe. The resounding success of the Warsaw operation removes any doubt about its outstanding efficacy in residential areas, they say. It was dropped in large quantities to maximize the number of fires and interspersed with waves of high explosive and shrapnel bombs to keep the population in shelters so that fires can spread to catastrophic levels. Only a few years later, the same strategy will be used against German cities. Allied bombers will fly similar missions, fully aware that tens of thousands of civilians will perish.
Blanket bombing always targets civilians. The point is that this is the first time it was used in the Second World War. It's also perhaps important to note that it was not the British or Americans who ordered the first bombing raids. The first blanket bombing was carried out by the German Luftwaffe.
In theory, the German bombardment may have been compliant with the Hague Land Warfare Convention. Warsaw was a defended city in a combat zone with substantial fortifications. In effect, the assault was a terror attack. Within hours, the city commander announces Warsaw's unconditional surrender. 120,000 soldiers in the city are now taken into German captivity, every moment captured on film by a Nazi propaganda team.
Mit Mann und Ross und Wagen.
Quoting a poem about Napoleon's ultimate defeat, the narrator stresses the scale of the Polish capitulation. The Polish defense now collapses nationwide. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Marshal Rydz-Schmieg, flees to Romania, following the footsteps of the government, which did the same in the middle of September. Sporadic fighting continues through to the 6th of October, but then all resistance ceases. 36 days after the invasion, the campaign is over. An average of around 1,940 Polish soldiers a day have been killed since the 1st of September. The final death toll is at least 70,000, and the list of wounded runs to 130,000. Apart from that, thousands of civilians have been murdered.
The brutalization of war is seen clearly in the invasion of Poland, and I think it is a very significant development, one that has rightly been highlighted by research in recent years. We see here the suspension of inhibitions against violence, also on the part of the military and individual soldiers, which will be a hallmark of the subsequent war with the Soviet Union.
The day before the last Polish units surrender, the Wehrmacht holds a victory parade in Warsaw in the presence of its supreme commander. The dictator enjoys the moment of triumph, but he is already making new plans for war.
What Hitler really wants to do after the Polish campaign is immediately launch a strike against France. But the army and its commander-in-chief, Walter von Brauchitsch, persuade him the time is not right. Winter is coming, we have no more bombs, and we have no more fuel. Hitler has no real idea what a desperate state the armed forces are in.
Victory in the Polish campaign masks the Wehrmacht's problems, which have become increasingly acute in recent weeks.
The ranks of the Wehrmacht swell from 100,000 men in 1933 to 2.6 million in 1939. That's a 40-fold increase in manpower within a few years, and it can only be achieved, of course, by significantly lowering recruitment standards. The Wehrmacht has endless problems in Poland. Advances and shelling in the wrong direction, action taken without consultation. It is a poorly prepared fighting force with significant shortcomings and massive problems. And it is only victorious in Poland because the chaos is even greater on the Polish side.
Tactical errors aside, the Wehrmacht has major supply problems. It is a far cry from the super army presented in the newsreels.
Even this fairly brief military campaign against Poland pushes the arms industry to its limits. Internal communications in winter 39-40 speak of a munitions crisis. It's an extraordinary situation. Parts of the Wehrmacht don't have enough grenades or ammunition. There's a shortage of bombs, and there are supply problems.
Dass es an Bomben fehlt, dass es Probleme beim Nachschub gibt.
The dictator responds to the crisis. At Hitler's instigation, a Ministry for Armaments and Munitions is created, and engineer Fritz Todt is appointed to head it. He had previously made a name for himself developing the Autobahn network.
Eine wichtige
An important solution to the munitions crisis is found, again with Hitler's intervention, by defining the areas on which armament should focus in the future. They are air armament, that is, aircraft construction, and the manufacture of ammunition. These are the two areas defined as crucial to the war effort.
Absolut zentral und im Mittelpunkt zu stehen habend festgelegt sind.
Just days after the Polish surrender, headlines are dominated by a feat of naval warfare. On the 17th of October, the submarine U-47, under the command of Günther Prien, enters the port of Kiel after a successful patrol. It has just attacked the British naval base at Scapa Flow.
In October 1939, when there's nothing newsworthy happening on the front lines, a German U-boat commander, Günther Prien, manages to penetrate the Scapa Flow defenses and sink an old British battleship, the Royal Oak.
The bay in the far north of Scotland is the main base of the British naval fleet and a place with special significance for the German Navy. After the First World War, the German High Seas Fleet was interned in Scapa Flow and in 1919 was scuttled on the orders of its own commander. 2 decades later, Nazi propaganda goes into overdrive over the U-boat captain's achievement. He is the propaganda machine's dream.
Nazi propaganda teams are always on the lookout for personal stories and images. An infantryman crouching in a trench is not a story I can tell. But I can tell stories about achievers. So submariners are hailed as heroes by the propaganda machine. They tick all the boxes. They are young and dynamic. They are valiant fighters. Unlike the grey ranks of the army and infantry, they are perfect for inspiring the young.
Anders als bei der grauen Masse des Heeres und der Infanterie.
Footage like this boosts the number of volunteers for submarine service. U-boat crews see themselves as a naval elite, but the majority of the men will pay for their delusion with their lives. Around 3/4 of all servicemen assigned to German U-boats do not live to see the end of the war. In Poland, after the military campaign is over, millions of people lose their homes. As early as the beginning of October, Hitler announced in the Reichstag that hundreds of thousands of ethnic Germans would be resettled in the west of Poland, and the ethnographic situation adjusted. The resettlement areas are cleared, existing communities brutally expelled. The Polish state is erased from the map.
The Germans' primary objective is to regain the eastern territories that had to be ceded under the Treaty of Versailles and swiftly reincorporate them into Germany. This results in the establishment of two new administrative subdivisions, Danzig, West Prussia, and Wartegau, around Poznan. A few smaller areas are also assigned to East Prussia and East Upper Silesia. But the bulk of Polish territory forms a separate zone known as the General Governorate. From the outset, this is intended as a place to deport undesirables.
On the 26th of October 1939, Hans Frank is appointed Governor General. A lawyer by profession and a convinced National Socialist, he takes up office in Wawel Castle in Krakow, once a residence of Polish kings. From the moment he is appointed, Frank pursues a brutal policy of exploitation against the population of the General Governorate.
One of the factors at play here was a national self-image. We are the new master race, and what we say here goes. You are our slaves, and you are here to work for us, to grow food for the German Reich. Apart from that, you are good for nothing. There is no thought of providing security for the civilian population. The purpose of administration and government is to extract the most from the Poles and secure German authority. Civilian suffering is accepted from the start. If the food situation is bad, if the harvest is poor, let them starve. That is more or less the attitude. Then there is the extremely brutal treatment of the Polish Jews in the General Governorate, and there are around 2 million of them.
In the early weeks of the war, thousands of Jews were murdered by SS death squads. Now, ghettos are created in many Polish cities, their inhabitants overcrowded and exploited. For many, life in these ghettos is the first phase of a harrowing ordeal, one that ends in millions of deaths.